of someone who's trying to get information out of the database using the SQL language to answer specific questions. Okay, any questions about those concepts? Okay. So what is the structure of a simple SQL query? There are 3 parts to an SQL query. The first part is called the select statement. The select statement is where you will identify the information, and you'll identify that by virtue of the column name or names that you want returned in the report or the data that you're pulling out of the database. So you're going to be asking a question, and in order to answer that question, you're going to want certain pieces of information returned from that database. The select statement identifies those pieces of information by the column name. And we're going to see some examples of this in a later slide to help clarify these concepts. The second element in the structure is the from keyword. So where the select statement identifies the information you want returned from the database to answer your question, the from keyword identifies the database table or tables from which that information is going to be retrieved. And it will identify those tables by table name, just like in the select statement, we identify that data by column name. And then the third element in the structure of a simple SQL query is the where keyword. And this is where you would identify any conditions or restrictions on the data that you're asking to be retrieved. And this is optional. And by that I mean you don't have to impose conditions or restrictions on the data that you're retrieving from the database. You can structure a query to simply return everything that's in that data table or tables. But if you're asking a very narrowly defined question, then more than likely you will have conditions or restrictions on the data that you're retrieving from the database. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll start talking about those concepts in relation to the example table that we had previously for our relational database. So the select statement, again, is going to identify the information I want returned from my query from the database by column name. So in our table example, we see 5 column names. We have name, F name or first name, city, age, and salary. If I was asking a question of this data that said, I want to see the name and the first name of every person in this table who is over the age of 30, then the 3 specific columns that I would likely want to see is name, F name, and age. Now, I may also want to see their city code and their salary as well. So whichever of those 5 columns I wanted to see in the data returned from my query, I would list in my select statement by column name. The from keyword identifies the table or tables from which the selected data will be retrieved. And again, just like we use column names in the select statement, we need to use the exact table name in the from keyword. Every database table in the data warehouse has a unique table name. In this case, I didn't put a table name in the example, but we could call this just example table. That might be the name of this table. So my from keyword would identify that I'm pulling in the name, the F name, the city, the age, and the salary from the example table. And the where keyword identifies the conditions or restrictions on the data that I wish to retrieve. And again, this is optional. So in my example, where I wanted to see information about individuals in this table who were over the age of 30, in that case, I would have a condition in my where keyword that indicates the value in the age column needs to be greater than 30. That would be a restriction or condition in my where keyword statement. If I wanted to see all of the data in this table, I would not have any where keyword restriction. Okay, so any questions at this point about the three basic elements in the structure of a simple SQL query? Okay. Now this slide shows an example of that SQL query, or of a simple SQL query using the data from that example table that we just looked at. So the box on the right is basically giving you the structure of that query. So in the select statement, I would have my column 1 name, and maybe my column 2 name, maybe my column 3 name, however many columns of data I wanted retrieved from that table name, whatever that table name is, and then where my condition or restriction is true. So in the left box, now we see the actual column names and table name and condition from a simple query. Select name and F name, which were the headings on those columns in our sample table, from our table name, example underscore table, where, and in this case I use salary, greater than 300. Now let's take a look at the syntax of our query. And we may refer back to that previous slide as well during this discussion. The syntax refers to the format of the way that the words are put together in the different elements of the query. So in my select statement, where we said the select statement has to include all of the column names that we want to have returned in our query, returned to us in our from the database, we would separate our list of column names by a comma. So, Molly, if you could go back to the prior slide, please. You can see in the box on the left where we wrote our select statement, we were bringing back two columns, name and F name, and we separated that list, those two elements, by a comma. That's the syntax that's required in the SQL query. And if that comma was missing, then depending upon what tool you were using, whether it's SQL Developer or the Toad application or whatever application you were using to actually run your query, you'd get an error message because it's expecting to see that those elements would be separated by a comma. In the event that we wanted to see every column in a table, we can use a wildcard character, the asterisk character, to tell our query to retrieve all of the columns in the table. So if we have a data table that contains 25 columns, and we wanted to see the data returned in every column for the records that we were looking for, instead of listing out all 25 column names separated by a comma, we could just simply use the wildcard character and type select asterisk. That's telling the SQL, that's telling the query tool, bring back everything in the table. The syntax for the from keyword, just like in the select statement, if we have multiple tables listed from which the data is to be retrieved, we would separate those listed tables by a comma. And all tables that are referenced in the select and the where statements must be listed in the from keyword section. So again, we see in this example on the left table, we have only one table from which we're retrieving our data, and the name of that table is example_table. If we were retrieving data from two database tables, we would separate those two table names by a comma, just like what you saw in the select statement. And lastly, in the syntax of the where keyword, the where keyword separates the list of conditions or restrictions, not by a comma this time, but by an operator. And an operator would be something like and or. Again, the where statement is where we are going to set restrictions or conditions on the data that we're retrieving from the database. And all of the statements in the where keyword section must be true. So in the example being displayed in the box on the left, we have one condition represented, salary greater than 300. If I wanted to impose two conditions and say salary greater than 300, in addition to age greater than 30, I would list both of those conditions and I would separate them by the word and. I want both of those conditions to be true in order for the data, in order to define the data that I want to see returned in my query. If I was structuring my query to say, I want either of those conditions to be true, either the salary is greater than 300 or age greater than 30, then the operator I would use to separate those two conditions is the or operator. Either this or that is true. And then the last, or the next syntax criteria for the where keyword condition, you define your condition using typical logical qualifiers. Something is equal to something. Something is greater than, less than. Something is in a list of these values. There are there are multiple logical qualifiers that can be used in those conditional statements. And again, there's additional training online that will give you additional information about the logical qualifiers that can be used in the where statement. And one other additional note about syntax in the where statement. In the example shown on the screen in the left box, you can see we've indicated salary, that column heading, greater than, and then we have the value of 300, but we have it surrounded by single quotes. Because that is a character value, because it is a variable, we would surround that value in quotes when we're using a value in our condition that can be a variable value. Okay, so any questions about the syntax that we talked about, separating our list of selected column names to be retrieved by a comma, separating our list of selected table names from where the data is being pulled by a comma, and then using the and or operator in our where statement with our logical references and our single quotes around variable data or information.
Lisa, one question was, in this example and some of the others you gave, it says where the condition is true. Would it ever be something other than true, such as false in that instance?
You can write your statement in the negative, but the negative statement must also be true. So I realize it's a little bit confusing. The conditions in the where statement must always be true, even if written in the negative. So if I was to say something like salary equal to 300, that's a positive, and that condition must be true. If I was to write that same statement to say salary not equal to 300, that would be written in the negative, but that condition must still be true in order for the data to meet that criteria.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Let's see if I can move on to the next one if we don't have any other questions. Okay. When multiple tables are listed in the from keyword section, the select item or select statement must include the table reference preceding the column name. So, in the example shown here, in the box on the left, we see I have two different data tables listed there. I have a data table called class_list that contains certain pieces of information. And I have a table called school_location, which contains different pieces of information. In my select statement, because SQL won't know where the column name or where the column heading name is located, I would want to include that table name separated by a period from the column name. So we see it represented here as class_list, which is my table name, dot NAME name, which is my column heading. And likewise, the second item in my select statement, we see the table name school_location dot and then state as the column heading. Now, not to confuse the issue here. If the column heading name was not present in the school location table, in other words, if the school location table had other column headings, but it did not have the column heading called name, then I wouldn't necessarily have to include that table name before the column heading name, because there's only one place to pull that from. That column only exists in one table. However, I recommend that you get into the habit of using the table name, regardless of whether you know if this column appears in your other data tables, especially as you're just getting started writing SQL, because you, number one, may not be completely familiar with the data in the tables, and number two, it's a good habit to get into to help you reinforce the concept of how the SQL logic works. If I did not include the table name in the select statement, and I happen to have a column heading called name in both of my tables, then what would happen is I would get data back in my query that was randomly associated and randomly pulled from both tables. Either that or I would get an error message, again, depending upon the tool that you're using to run your queries. You're either going to get an error message saying, hey, I've got two of these, which one am I looking for? Or you're not going to get that error message, but you're going to get random data pulled from both tables that will not have meaning. Okay, so any questions about that? Do we need to go through that a little bit in more detail? On the topic of multiple tables in your simple SQL query, when multiple tables are referenced, a table join is required to define the relation between those tables. And when you bring multiple tables into your SQL query, then there must be at least one key data column that is present with matching data in both tables. And you would select that table join under your where keyword section using the key data column. So let's take a look at an example and try to further clarify this concept. In the example in the box on the left, I have two data tables in my from statement. I have the class list table, and I have the school location table. In order for the data in those two tables to have a meaningful relationship, there must be one column in both tables that represents the same information. There must be one key column that represents, that will define a record in both tables. So for example, if these two tables contain information about individuals who've gone to a certain school, different pieces of information about those individuals, there still must be one common identifier between those two tables in order for the data in the tables to have meaning in relation to the other table. So let's say I've got individual Joe, Mary, and Sam. And I've identified those individuals by a key value, 1, 2, and 3. That's my key identifier number. Then that identifier number, 1, 2, and 3, must be present in both tables, so that when I bring back the name of the person from the class list, and I bring back the state from the school location table, I'm bringing back the state that corresponds to this name, not just some random state from some other person. I want to make sure that I'm getting the record from the school location table that contains the state for the same record, the same key as the name that I'm pulling out of the class list table. So the table join statement is always joined by virtue of an equal, because we're always talking about an equal condition. The ID in the class list table must equal the ID in the school location table. So to put this SQL, this entire SQL query into just a simple spoken statement, I want to see the name and the state for ID 1, who is Joe. I want to see Joe's name, and I want to see the state of Joe's school. I want to see the name and state for record 2. I want to see Mary's name and the state of Mary's school, etc. By joining on the ID, I will know that the state that's returned in my results corresponds to the name record. Otherwise, without this join, I would get random name and state combinations that had no meaning, because there's no logical relationship between the data coming from the two tables. Okay, any questions about that concept?
And Lisa, I have a question. Actually, here, key means it's nothing but a field for what? It's a table one dot key, right? So key is nothing but a field?
It is a column heading, yes. Each key field, or the key field in each table, I should say, has its own unique column heading.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
This is Vida here. It should have been better if you can show us the table as you showed the example table one. So like if you can show us the table and explain, I don't know whether you can do it at the time. But I feel if you can see the table, like you said, the field names in one table should match with the other one. So if you can show us the table, two types of tables and explain it, I think it will give us a little more concept.
No, and I don't think we had this table example in our slides, but that's an excellent suggestion. So maybe we need to add that into this training, to actually add a slide here, Molly, where we've got the two data tables with the information and the key column heading that shows the unique identifier that exists, that is shared between the two tables. That would be a great addition to the training. But unfortunately, I don't have it to show you right now. Okay, great question. Anything else at this point? Okay. Then I think we can probably go to the next slide, Molly. There we go. Okay. So just reviewing again our key terms, the query is basically the question that we're asking from the data in the database. And one of the most critical concepts in building this query or building this question is understanding exactly what question am I asking? What question am I asking? What criteria am I limited, or am I limiting this query to? What is it that I'm really trying to get out of this data? So having a good understanding of your data will help you to craft a very specific question or query. SQL, again, is the acronym for Structured Query Language. That's the programming language that we use to ask our question and retrieve our data. Syntax is the way in which the SQL language is formatted and organized within the query. And then the three structural elements include the select statement, which identifies the information we're trying to retrieve, the from statement, which identifies the tables where the data can be found, and the where section, the where keyword section, which will identify the conditions or restrictions we're placing on the data. And at that, again, the next slide I think contains a couple of links for some additional online information that you can find about SQL that goes deeper and more in depth into SQL training. And are there any wrap-up questions for us?
Let's have one more question from Leela. Will you be going through the inner joins and outer joins in the next session?
So, Leela, answer your question. The training for SQL that we're providing is just this basic version. I did schedule 2 sessions because I was unsure how long it was going to end up taking and if we were going to need some extra time for questions and those types of things. So we have the 2 sessions scheduled, but it looks like we will just be needing this 1 session. So we're not going further in depth, but you can access some additional further information based on the links that we provided here.
So this is the 1 session we have for the SQL, not on the 5th.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that question.
So we don't have the training on the 5th of May as we scheduled?
Right, we'll probably be canceling that as we've completed it all in this 1 session. But we'll talk about that after we get through any other questions people have.
Oh.
Any other questions for Lisa?
Yeah, Molly, this is Becky. I'm sorry I kind of came late to this party today. But did you say we were going to have access to this, these sets of slides?
Yes, we'll be.
You're going to email this to us?
Mm-hmm. We'll get it posted out there, and I'll provide the link of where it's stored in SharePoint.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Lisa, let's talk about the exercises that go along with this next.
So we have 2 exercises that will follow this training. This introduction course and the recommended website training will give you pretty good preparation for accurately completing those exercises. Step 2, I guess you'll be contacting Molly or Alex when you're ready to complete the exercises and then return your answers. And Molly can probably give you more information on that.
Yeah. So in the follow-up email today, you'll receive a copy of the exercises. It will be in a Word document that will provide you with some examples of tables and information. You'll actually be writing some of the SQL queries directly in your response to the exercises. So there are several different questions that will be answered, or I'm sorry, that you'll be asked throughout, and you'll submit those responses. You can submit them directly to me, and I'll provide all that instruction in the email that follows this.
And Molly, do we have any time to return these answers? Do we have any durations? At what time we have to complete these exercises?
Right. We'll be in terms of completing all of this. What we'll do is we'll give you a week, so that will allow you time to review this training again, ask any questions that you have. We'll follow up with you based on questions that we receive. I know sometimes during the live training, it's hard to think of what questions you have on the spot until you're getting your hands on the content. So we'll allow some extra time for questions and for you to complete these exercises.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Hey Molly, will you be sending the slides again to us in the email or not?
Mm-hmm. As I said, to be in SharePoint, and I'll be providing the link to where those are stored.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay, so quick review here. I'll be sending the following the session today. It actually won't be right away because of some conflicts I have, but this afternoon at the latest, you will receive the link to where the session content is located. You're going to receive the exercises from the session, and you're going to receive the details, including the links that were out here about retrieving additional information about SQL. Throughout this week, you should review all this content again. See if there's any questions that you have about any of the content that we went over today. Send those questions to me via email, and I'll coordinate with Lisa to get responses out to you and or the group if they're relevant across the board. You'll be completing the exercises by submitting those back to me. In about a week, I'll give the exact date in the email. I don't have the calendar up in front of me now. And the session is going to be in SharePoint, and I'll provide that link in the email as well. And the additions we talked about with the charts that will refer to the second example that we had in this slide, we'll make sure to get those added out there. They may not be in the initial version posted, but we will get them out there as soon as we can. And for Thursday's session that we had scheduled at the same time, since we did complete all of our content today, you will receive cancellation for Thursday's session. So you can anticipate that instead, since you had set aside that time. It would be a great hour to save for reviewing the content again. So now that we are just a minute under when we were going to end today, we will go ahead and call it quits. So thank you all so much for joining today, and a special thank you to Lisa for sharing all of this information. We will, I'll answer any other further questions that you have via email. So thank you all so much.